Welcome to Glisso English. Real life stories.
Welcome back to the channel. Today, we are diving into a story that many of us know all too well, the struggle between following your heart and meeting the expectations of the people who sacrificed everything for you. We are going to follow a story called Cultural Gap. It's about that difficult space where a child of immigrants dreams of a life in art, while their parents see medicine or engineering as the only safe way to survive. As we go through these 10 chapters, we aren't just going to look at the drama. We're going to focus on how to handle these real-life problems in English. You'll learn how to express your boundaries, how to explain your passion, and how to understand the emotional logic behind your parents' fears. By the end of this video, you'll have the vocabulary to talk about your dreams and the tools to navigate the most difficult conversations life can throw at you. Let's get started with Chapter 1, The Dinner Table Blueprint. The aroma of saffron and roasted lamb filled the small dining room, a scent that usually signaled comfort. To Omar, however, the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. His father, Malik, leaned forward, his eyes bright with a pride that felt like a weight around Omar's neck. "I spoke with Dr. Aris today," Malik said, his voice booming with satisfaction. "He says the pre-med track is grueling, but with your grades, Omar, you will glide through it. A doctor in the family. Finally, our sacrifices have a face." His mother, Amira, nodded fervently, placing a second helping of rice on Omar's plate as if nourishment alone could guarantee a medical license. "It is the only safe path, Habibi. Engineering or medicine, these are the professions that cannot be taken away from you, no matter where you go in this world." Omar felt the familiar itch in his fingertips. Beneath his chair, tucked safely out of sight, was his sketchbook. It contained a charcoal study of his father's hands, rough, calloused, and expressive. He didn't see a doctor's future when he looked at them. He saw the story of a man who had built a life from nothing. "I've been thinking about the summer program," Omar began, his voice barely a whisper. "The one at the Institute of Fine—" "A hobby is a beautiful thing, Omar," Malik interrupted, not unkindly, but with a finality that closed the door. "But a hobby does not pay the rent or buy a home. We did not cross an ocean so you could paint pictures. We crossed it so you could be secure." Omar went silent, the blueprint of his life already drawn by hands other than his own. The transition from the dinner table to the classroom felt like crossing a border every single day. At the university library, Omar sat surrounded by thick leather-bound volumes of human anatomy. To his parents, these books were the keys to the kingdom, the holy texts of a stable life. To Omar, they were simply references for muscle structure and bone density. He spent his mornings mastering the complex language of biology. He memorized terms like cardiovascular and homeostasis, repeating them until they felt natural on his tongue. He knew his parents loved the sound of these words. They sounded like safety. They sounded like a son who would never have to worry about money. But when the clock struck 4, Omar retreated to the back corner of the campus art studio. Here, the vocabulary shifted entirely. He traded pathology for composition and neurology for perspective. He began to see the world not through a microscope, but through a lens of light and shadow. One afternoon, his professor stopped by his easel, looking at a half-finished oil painting of a crowded subway station. "You have a gift for capturing the chiaroscuro of urban life, Omar," the professor remarked. "The way you use high contrast to show human isolation is remarkable." Omar smiled, but the compliment felt bittersweet. He was becoming fluent in 2 different languages, but he couldn't use them in the same room. At home, he was a future surgeon. In the studio, he was a storyteller. The gap between these two worlds was widening, and Omar knew that eventually he would have to choose which language he wanted to speak for the rest of his life. It was a rainy Sunday afternoon, and the smell of cardamom tea drifted through the living room. Omar sat on the floor, ostensibly highlighting a textbook on organic chemistry, while his father, Malik, sat in his favorite armchair. Malik stared out the window at the gray sky, his expression softening as he began to tell a story Omar had heard 1,000 times before. "When we arrived in this country, Omar, I had $40 in my pocket and a degree that no one recognized," Malik said quietly. "I spent 3 years washing dishes and sweeping floors so that you would never have to know what it feels like to be invisible." He looked at Omar, his voice trembling slightly with the weight of old memories. "Art is for those who have a safety net, for those whose families have been here for generations. For people like us, survival is the only art that matters. If you are a doctor, you are never invisible. You are necessary." Amira walked in, placing a hand on Malik's shoulder and looking down at Omar with a mixture of love and anxiety. "Your father isn't trying to stifle your spirit, Habibi," she added softly. "We just don't want you to be hungry. In our home country, we saw many poets and painters struggle to buy bread. We worked so hard so that you could choose the safe bet, the path where the world will always respect you." Omar looked down at his textbook, the chemical formulas blurring before his eyes. He understood the emotional logic behind their fear. It wasn't about control, it was about protection. To his parents, a career in art wasn't a dream, it was a vulnerability. He realized then that his struggle wasn't just about what he wanted to do, but about proving that their sacrifices hadn't been in vain. The silence that followed was heavy with the things Omar couldn't bring himself to say. He realized that to bridge this gap, he would have to find a way to show them that his passion wasn't a rejection of their hard work. The university application portal glowed like a cold digital eye in the darkness of Omar's bedroom. It was 2 in the morning, the only time when the house was silent enough for him to think clearly. On one tab of his browser, the application for the State Medical University was complete, waiting only for a final click. His father's words about security echoed in the quiet room, making his finger hover over the mouse. On another tab, hidden behind the first, was the application for the National Institute of Fine Arts. To apply to the art program, he had to upload a digital portfolio, a collection of everything he had created in secret. He looked at his screen, seeing the 2 different futures laid out in front of him like a fork in the road. One path led to a prestigious office and the relieved smiles of his parents, but a life of stifled creativity. The other path led to an uncertain studio and a potential rift in his family, but a life where he could finally breathe. Omar took a deep breath, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He thought about the real-life problems his father had faced, the hunger, the cold, and the invisibility. He wondered if his art could ever be strong enough to shield him from those same hardships. With a trembling hand, he clicked Submit on the art application first, the digital confirmation appearing like a quiet spark of light. Seconds later, he submitted the medical application as well, fulfilling the promise he had made to his family. He had successfully doubled his life, creating a secret world that existed right alongside the one his parents saw. As he closed his laptop, Omar realized he was living on borrowed time. The truth was now a ticking clock, and sooner or later, one of those 2 envelopes would change everything. He lay back in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling both the thrill of rebellion and the heavy guilt of deception. Saturday morning usually meant a deep clean of the house, a ritual Amira approached with rhythmic precision. Omar was at the library, or so he had said, leaving his bedroom door slightly ajar. As Amira reached under the bed to clear away dust, her hand struck something solid and flat. She pulled out a large canvas wrapped carefully in an old bedsheet to protect it from the light. She peeled back the fabric and gasped, seeing a vibrant, unfinished oil painting of their local neighborhood market. The colors were bold and the brushstrokes were thick, capturing the chaotic energy of the fruit stalls and the tired faces of the vendors. It wasn't a hobby sketch, it was a professional piece of work that commanded the entire room. Just then, the front door clicked open and Omar walked in, his face turning pale as he saw his mother standing over his secret. "What is this, Omar?" she asked, her voice a mixture of confusion and genuine awe. Omar scrambled for words, his mind racing to find a way to deflect the truth without lying entirely. "It's just a project, Mama," he said, stepping into the room and gently taking the canvas from her hands. "A way to relax after studying the nervous system. It helps me focus on my science books." Amira looked from the painting to her son, noticing for the first time the faint stains of Prussian blue under his fingernails. "You spend a lot of time on this relaxation, don't you?" she whispered, her eyes searching his for an answer he wasn't ready to give. She didn't get angry, but the silence between them grew heavy with the weight of what she now suspected. Omar realized that the closet was no longer a safe place for his dreams. The physical evidence of his passion was becoming too large to hide. He tucked the painting back into the shadows, but the image of his mother's surprised face remained burned into his mind. He knew he was running out of diversions, and the safe path was starting to feel like a cage he had built himself. 2 weeks later, the mail arrived with a finality that made the air in the hallway feel thin. Omar found the 2 envelopes sitting on the console table, both bearing the official seals of his future. One was thick and heavy, embossed with the crest of the State Medical University. The other was a simple, elegant ivory envelope from the National Institute of Fine Arts. He took them to the park, sitting on a bench far away from the watchful eyes of his neighborhood. He opened the medical letter first. "We are pleased to offer you admission." He felt a strange numbness. It was the victory his parents had spent 20 years working for. Then he opened the ivory envelope. "It is our pleasure to inform you that you have been awarded the Director's Scholarship for Excellence in Visual Arts." A full scholarship. It was the one thing he hadn't dared to hope for, a shield against the argument of poverty. He sat there for an hour, the 2 papers resting on his knees like 2 different versions of himself. To choose the scholarship was to tell his parents that their definition of safety was not his. To choose the medical school was to accept a life of what-ifs and resentment. The weight of choosing between his own joy and his parents' pride felt like a physical pressure in his chest. He thought of his father's calloused hands and his mother's anxious eyes, realizing that either choice would break a heart. For the first time in his life, Omar realized that being a good son and being a whole person were moving in opposite directions. He tucked both letters into his bag, knowing that the time for secret applications was over. Tonight he would have to walk through the front door and finally speak the truth out loud. He stood up, his legs feeling heavy, and began the long walk home to face the confrontation that would change everything. The dinner table was set, but no one was eating. The 2 letters lay in the center of the polished wood, side by side, like a challenge. "A scholarship for painting?" Malik asked, his voice low and dangerous, a sharp contrast to his usual booming tone. "You applied to this behind our backs while we were celebrating your future in medicine?" Omar took a deep breath, his hands clenched under the table to stop them from shaking. "I didn't do it to hurt you, Baba," Omar said, trying to keep his English steady and respectful. "But I cannot spend my life looking through a microscope when I see the world in colors and stories. Colors do not pay for surgery. Stories do not buy a roof for your children," Malik shouted, slamming his hand on the table. Amira sat between them, her eyes filling with tears as she looked at the ivory envelope as if it were a poison. "We came here so you wouldn't have to struggle, Omar," she whispered. "This art is a luxury for people who have never known what it is to have nothing." "That is the gap between us," Omar stood up, his voice rising with a year's worth of suppressed frustration. "You think survival is the only goal, but I want to do more than just survive. I want to live. Art is how we solve the real-life problems of the soul. It's how we make sense of the struggle you went through." "If you go this way," Malik said, his face hardening into a mask of stone, "you go alone. We will not fund a life that leads to the very poverty we escaped." "The scholarship covers everything," Omar replied quietly, the words feeling like a final goodbye. He realized that the bridge had collapsed, and for the first time, the house he loved felt like a place where he no longer belonged. He turned and walked toward the door, leaving the 2 letters and his parents' expectations behind him in the silence. The transition from the family home to a cramped third-floor studio apartment felt like stepping into a cold bath. Omar's new world was defined by the smell of turpentine and the constant humming of a radiator that never quite got warm. Without his parents' support, he quickly learned that his scholarship covered tuition, but not the daily, real-world problems of rent and groceries. He took a part-time job at a local coffee shop, working the early morning shift before his art classes began. Here, his English began to change. It was no longer the formal language of biology or the respectful tone he used with his father. It was the fast-paced, pragmatic English of the service industry, learning to handle difficult customers and negotiate with a landlord. There were nights when he sat in his studio staring at a half-empty box of cereal, wondering if his father had been right about survival. The silence of the studio was a sharp contrast to the lively, saffron-scented dinners he had known all his life. He missed his mother's voice, but every time he picked up the phone, the memory of the confrontation at the table stopped him. Instead of calling, he poured his loneliness into his work, painting the faces of the people he saw at the coffee shop. He realized that to be a professional artist, he had to be his own manager, his own advocate, and his own provider. The starving artist trope wasn't a romantic story. It was a grueling test of his resolve. Despite the cold and the hunger, there was a new sense of ownership over his days that he had never felt before. He was finally living a life that was entirely his own, even if the cost of that freedom was a heavy heart. He began to understand that independence wasn't just about making choices, it was about having the strength to live with the consequences. The opening night of the Emerging Voices gallery exhibition was a blur of bright lights and nervous energy. Omar stood in the corner of the white-walled room, wearing a thrift store suit that felt a size too small. On the center wall hung his masterpiece, a series of 3 large canvases titled The Translation of Sacrifice. The paintings didn't show doctors or engineers. They showed the tired, beautiful reality of immigrant life. He had found a found family among his classmates, other artists who understood the cost of a creative life. They cheered for him, but Omar's eyes kept drifting toward the gallery entrance, hoping to see 2 familiar faces.
Every time the bell chimed, his heart skipped a beat, but it was always a stranger or a critic. A well-known art reviewer approached him, asking about the vocabulary of shadow in his work. Omar spoke with a new confidence, using the professional English he had mastered over the grueling year. He explained that his art was a bridge, an attempt to make the invisible struggle of his parents visible to the world. The critic nodded, scribbling notes about emotional authenticity and cultural resonance. Despite the praise and the red sold stickers appearing on his smaller sketches, a hollow ache remained in his chest. He realized that success felt different when the people who inspired the work weren't there to witness it. He had proved he could survive, and he had proved he was an artist, but the victory felt incomplete. As the gallery lights began to dim, Omar realized that he couldn't force a bridge to be built from only one side. He had extended his hand through his art, and now all he could do was wait for them to see it. He left the gallery alone, the cold night air hitting his face as he walked back toward his quiet studio. A week after the exhibition, the gallery owner called Omar with a message that made his breath catch. Someone had come in during the quiet afternoon hours, long after the opening night crowds had vanished. They hadn't bought anything, but they'd spent nearly an hour standing in front of the triptych of his father's hands. That evening, a soft knock sounded on the door of Omar's studio, a sound he hadn't heard in over a year. He opened it to find Malik and Amira standing in the hallway, looking small against the backdrop of the industrial building. The silence was thick, but it was no longer the sharp, jagged silence of the dinner table. "We saw the paintings, Omar," Malik said, his voice rough and devoid of the old booming authority. "I saw my own hands in your work, but I saw them the way you see them, as something worth remembering." Amira stepped forward, handing him a small container wrapped in a familiar cloth. It was saffron rice and roasted lamb. "We still worry, Habibi," she whispered, her eyes finally meeting his. "We worry because the world is hard. But we saw that you were not just painting pictures, you were telling the story of why we came here." There was no grand apology, and there was no sudden agreement that art was a safe path. Instead, there was a newly built bridge of mutual respect, a recognition that both survival and soul mattered. They sat in the small studio, eating together on mismatched chairs, surrounded by canvases and sketches. Omar realized that the cultural gap wouldn't disappear overnight, but they were finally speaking the same language. He was a son, and he was an artist. His parents were survivors, and now they were witnesses to his success. The story didn't end with a perfect resolution, but with a beginning, a way to move forward together. As they talked late into the night, the studio felt warm for the very first time.
The journey of Omar and his parents remind us that love and fear often speak different languages. For Malik and Amira, love was spelled security, medicine, and safety. For Omar, love was spelled truth, expression, and authenticity. The cultural gap isn't a wall that needs to be torn down. It is a space that needs a bridge. By staying true to his passion while honoring his family's history through his art, Omar transformed his parents' fear into a new kind of pride. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was an honest one, where two generations finally stopped arguing and started listening. Thank you so much for following Omar's journey with me today. Stories like this show us that learning English isn't just about passing an exam or getting a job. It's about finding the right words to bridge the gaps in our own lives. Whether you were struggling with family expectations or trying to find your own safe path, remember that your story has value. If you enjoyed this 10-chapter series, make sure to let me know in the comments which part of Omar's struggle felt the most real to you. You will find all the vocabulary of the story below in the description box. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next story. Keep practicing, keep sharing your truth, and I will see you in the next story. Goodbye.